It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on Russia, Ukraine, and the future of deterrence, a session with Dr. Wyn Bowen from King's College London. Before introducing our speaker, let me just say a little bit to set the context. We have tremendous interest in this topic today, as we have on every session that we've done on Ukraine for the past year or so. And this naturally reflects the interest today naturally reflects the discussion we've all been having since the war began in the winter about deterrence, a discussion about whether deterrence failed, and if so, how, and whether that includes nuclear deterrence, and a separate discussion about whether and how deterrence might yet fail, including especially nuclear deterrence in the period ahead. And of course, in recent weeks, President Putin and his leadership group have rattled the nuclear saber loudly and concentrated the minds of Western decision makers, but also the Western public, on the risks that would be associated with continued assistance to the government and people of Ukraine. And we are engaged in a debate, as you all know, about how employment of nuclear weapons by President Putin might be seen by President Putin as useful or necessary. These topics are intensely debated in NATO capitals. I'm sure they're debated in Beijing as well. And in the capitals of our allies in East Asia. But of course, they're most intensely debated in European capitals, where there is a palpable sense of anxiety about the effectiveness of deterrence in meeting the current nuclear threat from Russia. And there's a particularly engaging and wide-ranging debate on these issues in London. Naturally enough, the United Kingdom has significant equities in all of this. And our speaker today has been a central player in the debate in the UK on matters of nuclear deterrence and deterrence generally in the war on Ukraine. And I'm grateful that he's able to join us today to share his thinking with us and to begin a discussion. Dr. Wyn Bowen is a professor at King's College London. In August, he stepped down after 6 years as head of the School of Security Studies at King's. Prior to serving as head of school, he was Dean of Academic Studies in the Defense Studies Department of King's College, based at the UK Joint Services Command and Staff College. He also served previously as director of King's Center for Science and Security Studies. He has assumed some new duties. He is co-director of King's College Freeman Air and Space Institute, and he's a William Penney Fellow at the UK Atomic Weapons Establishment. And not last and not least, he's going to spend part of this academic year with us as a visiting scientist and a visiting foreign affairs fellow at CGSR. He has a bachelor's from the University of Hull in England and a master's and PhD from the University of Birmingham. Wyn, thank you so much for making the time to do this. Let me review the basics for the group. You're going to speak for approximately 45 minutes or so, a little bit longer perhaps. There will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Our preference is to bring people in personally into the conversation, so please raise your hand electronically. But if you'd like to put a question in the chat function, please go ahead and do so, and I'll do my best to get those into play in the time available to us. Without further ado, Wyn, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brad, and good morning to everybody. And many thanks to the Centre and to the laboratory for hosting me as a visiting scientist this academic year. It's a real privilege for me to be associated. It's a career highlight, and I'm hugely grateful to Brad for suggesting at the back end of last year on the sidelines of a meeting in DC that we were both at. So I'm very happy to be here, as you can tell. Next slide, please. So the talk I'm going to give over the next 45 or so minutes, Russia, Ukraine and the future of deterrence, I struggled with the title a little bit, specifically including the word future in it. I always tell my students to look backwards in their papers and presentations so there's a good empirical record to draw on. And if they insist on looking forward, to try to confine that to fleeting mentions, perhaps in the conclusion. So I'm going against my own advice and inclination by including it. But more seriously, these are, of course, very, very serious times, as Brad has just said. And we do need to think about what may come next in terms of deterrence and strategic stability. So my talk this morning is going to be in 3 parts. First, I'm going to briefly talk about the enduring nature of deterrence, but its evolving character. And in that vein, I will look at evolving Western and non-Western thinking about deterrence, pre and post Crimea 2014. Second, I want to talk about how deterrence has featured and is featuring in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine, including but not confined to nuclear. And that will be about 50% of my talk. And then the second 50% hopefully will be the third part, where I'll highlight some issues relevant to how we think about the future of deterrence. There are caveats, of course, like any talk like this. So the war's ongoing, of course. So it's a challenge sometimes to do sort of analysis of a moving target. The war is at a very dangerous moment, it feels. We've seen significant levels of escalation in recent weeks in different domains, and with various statements from Russian officials. So these events are constantly moving. And finally, my final caveat, of course, is that I only have access to open source. So this is based on open source data. Next slide, please. So I believe I'm on safe ground to begin by arguing that the nature of deterrence does not change over time. And what I mean by that is that deterrence will always involve either the threat to deny an objective to a challenger or to punish a challenger for crossing a threshold, or potentially both. So it's about cost-benefit analysis related to that. While this nature of deterrence may not change, however, its character certainly does. And this involves developments across a broad range of areas: political, economic, societal, technological, legal, and military developments in these areas constantly influence the character of deterrence, and it's very context specific. The technological dimension in particular has influenced the character of deterrence over time. In the nuclear area, for example, this has directly influenced nuclear weapons policies and doctrines, whether it be the advent of solid fuel, the development of multiple warheads because of the ability to miniaturize nuclear warheads, submarine basing, and the like. Technical developments in the digital world, where cyber vulnerabilities have exponentially increased, have also contributed to changes in how states think about deterrence. The performance of unmanned air combat systems in an anti-armor role in Ukraine could potentially come to be viewed through a similar lens in conventional deterrence terms going forward. The coercive flip side of deterrence involves threats and potentially the imposition of escalating costs to change the behavior of other actors. Thomas Schelling referred to this as compellence, and it's also frequently referred to as coercive diplomacy. Once a deterrent fails, of course, subsequent threats to reverse the situation become compellent in nature as the focus becomes changing behavior after a red line has been crossed. And in Ukraine, this is illustrated well with the blurring of deterrence and compellence as concepts. And again, to quote Schelling, he talked about once an engagement starts, a military engagement starts, the difference between deterrence and compellence may disappear. Next slide, please. So from the end of the Cold War through to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, there had been little really in the way of novel thinking about deterrence in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the West more broadly. And an exception to this was the concept of tailored deterrence that emerged in the mid-2000s and Elaine Bunn championed and wrote about, which emphasized the need to adopt a more bespoke approach to deterrence based on the specifics of the challenger to be deterred, whether, for example, that might be Iran or the DPRK, for example. But this post-Cold War period, from a Western perspective, was characterized mostly by interventionism and the use of coercive diplomacy by the Western world, where the objective more often than not was to use threats and escalating force to change the behavior of regional powers like Iraq, like Iran, etc., that had interests antithetical to our own, whether it was the pursuit of WMD programs, harboring terrorist groups, and the like. But at the same time, many non-Western states during this period did a great deal of thinking about deterrence. I'm principally thinking here about Russia, China, and Iran. We have seen the emergence of Russia's concept of strategic deterrence, China's multi-instrument deterrence, and Iran's comprehensive deterrence. All three incorporate a broad approach to deterrence, integrating military and non-military levers, including the use of proxies, niche military capabilities for anti-access area denial, for example, precision strike missile capability, information warfare, cyber operations, and so on. And each of these broad concepts also incorporates aspects of compellence, which I've just referred to. And all three were directly influenced by a perception of being vulnerable to Western intervention in the post-Cold War period. In terms of Western thinking on deterrence, Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a key turning point. And when I say Western thinking, I probably mean US and British thinking initially, and by linkage then through NATO and to allied countries. The evolution in Western deterrence thinking since 2014 was directly influenced by Russia's use of hybrid or grey zone operations below the traditional threshold of conflict in Crimea and also in eastern Ukraine back in 2014. Russia's actions were ambiguous. Moscow coordinated the use of disinformation, proxy actions, and cyber operations, and there was a hint of a nuclear threat in the background to complicate any Western thinking about stepping in. The first policy and doctrinal hints of a new Western approach to deterrence began to appear in official thinking around about 2015. Next slide, please. US Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who so sadly passed away earlier this week, famously said in October 2015 that we must write a new playbook, which includes preparing to counter new challenges like cyber and hybrid, better integrating conventional and nuclear, adjusting our posture and presence to adapt to new challenges and threats. Similarly, the UK National Security Strategy and Security and Defence Review in 2015 noted the need for a full spectrum approach to deterrence going forward. In essence, these were formal recognitions of the requirement to conceive of deterrence levers more broadly, and it reflected what had happened in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But it also reflected wider concerns about how future adversaries would increasingly challenge Western interests below the traditional threshold of war, whether that was in Europe, whether that was in the South China Sea, whether that's cyberspace, wherever it may be. China's increasingly coercive approach to realizing its goals in the South China Sea with regard to Taiwan was another particular cause for concern, and obviously still is. And then most recently in the United States, we've seen the emerging concept of integrated deterrence. And again, I've just included a small quote there from the current Secretary of Defense, where he talks about the importance of integrating networks, integrating capability, operations, and allies. So the Russia-Ukraine war has put all of this under the spotlight. And we are at, I think, a very important inflection point in terms of considering what the war means for evolving Western thinking about deterrence, but also relatedly about strategic stability. Before looking forward, I think it's important to think about deterrence, or how deterrence has featured in the Ukraine context since sort of late 2021 up to the present. And we can consider this in a pre-24th of February context and a post-24th of February context. Next slide, please. So pre-24th of February, I think there are at least three dimensions to deterrence in this period. There may be others, but there are three obvious ones. First, there was the US-UK-led Western effort to try to deter Russia from invading, or perhaps we should say further invading Ukraine. Second, NATO sought to deter Russian action against member countries in the alliance. And third, Russia sought to deter US and NATO from becoming directly involved in any ensuing conflict. The Russians succeeded at this stage and subsequently in preventing NATO from getting directly involved in the conflict. Key to this prior to the 24th of February was nuclear signaling. Prior to the invasion, this most notably involved bringing forward an annual exercise for strategic nuclear forces. At the same time, of course, direct military involvement had been ruled out by the United States and others in order to reduce the chances of direct escalation with NATO. The Western effort at this stage to deter action against NATO countries also worked at this point. But as we know, the effort to deter the invasion or further invasion failed. And I think two related questions are important here. How credible was the Western deterrence effort? And was Putin actually deterrable? So I'm going to try to unpack these a little bit now. Next slide, please. So on the first, in terms of deterrence credibility, I think it's important to recognize that the US and UK clearly did not have great hopes that deterrence would succeed. And senior officials in Washington and London were very public about stating that they thought Russia was going to invade. But in terms of deterrence credibility, it's important to highlight a few things, right? Red lines were clearly drawn and communicated about the invasion itself and also about not horizontally escalating against NATO. There was pretty good coordination of deterrence messaging across NATO, the European Union, and G7 countries. The threat, as we know, primarily focused on enormous economic sanctions as a deterrent. But also there was the threat of increased security assistance to Ukraine. There was also some interesting communication to Russia on the likely insurgency that was perceived likely to follow an invasion by Russia. At that stage, clearly, the poor performance of the Russian military was not forecast. There was unprecedented declassification of intelligence to call out Russia's intent and to bring allies up to speed on Russia's intentions too, and to bolster the resolve. Alliance forces were moved to eastern member countries alongside Ukraine and Russia. The fact NATO is a nuclear alliance was clearly part of its deterrence posture, but there was no obvious nuclear signaling on the part of the alliance. However, at the same time, this was an effort to extend deterrence over Ukraine, a non-treaty bound partner. And you read the literature on extended deterrence, it's always more challenging than doing direct deterrence with a potential challenger. So this was always going to affect perceptions of deterrence credibility in Moscow. As I've noted already, direct NATO military involvement was also ruled out, understandably so, but again, would have contributed to a perception of credibility in Moscow. And NATO, of course, the alliance, but also thinking about the EU as well, the G7. When you collective actors do deterrence, it's always quite challenging. So whilst the US and the UK demonstrated significant resolve prior to the 24th of February, this wasn't necessarily uniform across all European allies in the EU and NATO context. So prior to 24th of February, I think, and since then, this political cohesion of the West has been our center, our strategic center of gravity. It was then, and it has been since. While ultimately deterrence failed at this level, this pre-war effort to deter Russia was always going to be essential to shifting gears in the event of the need to respond to an invasion if one was launched. That is, delivering on a failed deterrent threat to punish Russia, and also to move into a mix of deterrence and compellence in the context of the ongoing conflict. Next slide, please. So that's looking at the credibility aspect. What about thinking about the deterrability of Putin? So I've got a few things to sort of flag here. If you think about motivation to begin with, well, Putin was clearly determined to try to bring Ukraine to heel and to subjugate Ukraine. For lots of different reasons that we all know, and I won't rehearse here, moving closer to NATO, Western leaning, EU aspirations, and so on and so forth. We can also look at the draft treaties that President Putin came up with in, I think it was late November or early December 2021, about what his which outlined his goals, which were really maximalist goals, and raised questions about whether these were realistic starting points for some sort of approach to solving Russia's issues with the West, and also the extent to which this was just about Ukraine, or the extent to which he was motivated by just changing European security order more broadly, and as a result of that, the wider international order. So there was clearly a determination, motivation to do something on his part. But I think, in retrospect, is very helpful here. There were clearly certain assumptions that he was operating under, and we now can think about those assumptions more straightforwardly, given what has subsequently happened in the war. I'm sure there are other assumptions, but some of these probably include an underestimation of the Ukrainian armed forces' ability to innovate and to repel and complicate Russian military operations, particularly during the first part of the war, before Moscow switched its focus to the east and more to the south. An overestimation of the Russian military's ability to successfully prosecute a multi-front campaign of a type that doesn't train for and exercise for. A related underestimation of the security assistance, both in equipment and training terms, that NATO countries had provided since 2014, and then the willingness to ramp this assistance up after the invasion. An underestimation of the Western and the European in particular willingness to punish and impose major economic costs on Russia, particularly those aspects related to the energy sector. To what extent, was Putin basing his view on an inaccurate assessment of the balance of stakes involved in this context? Was there an incorrect assessment of the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a sign of US Western lack of will to intervene overseas to protect non-treaty bound partners? I remember when the withdrawal happened in Afghanistan, I took the opposite conclusion, that actually this was about prioritizing challenges in the world. Was there a potential perception of a closing window of opportunity to act in Moscow, politically or militarily? Clearly, as we know, Putin has been isolated too, and I think this raises the question of whether there was the lack of any advice within his inner circle emphasizing caution as it came to Ukraine. And were the wrong lessons from the Russian military involvement in Syria taken? Russia was operating in a permissive environment in Syria, really, for its air and missile operations. And of course, some off-ramps were offered by the United States to try to sort of head off the invasion, discussion of missile deployments, confidence building, etc. But none of those worked. Next slide, please. So if we move on to the war itself, so post 24th of February, deterrence has continued to play an intra-war role. For its part, Russia has continued to try to deter Western involvement. And I think there have been two goals here, two obvious goals. First, deterrence has continued to be principally about preventing direct NATO military involvement in Ukraine. And this appears to have been successful to date. Russian nuclear signaling since 24th of February has involved raising Russia's nuclear alert status, an ICBM test, numerous statements from several officials, both playing up and playing down the nuclear risks at different times in the context of the war. With the success and of the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive, the nuclear rhetoric has heated up considerably, as we've all seen. Russia has also tried to deter NATO, providing significantly increased security assistance to Ukraine. Russian officials have made various statements that NATO security assistance to Ukraine could lead to escalation. And the Russian effort here has arguably had some success in terms of cementing NATO's own wariness over providing certain types of capabilities, like ATACMS, for example, with longer strike ranges because of a fear of escalating the war. But the Russian effort has also manifestly failed to deter the provision of significant conventional capabilities, such as the now famous HIMARS system, which have directly enabled the Ukrainian forces to stop the Russian offensive, to force a change in Russia's focus to the east and the south, and to go on to the counteroffensive. For their part, the Western allies have been seeking to do a few things. First, to deter certain types of Russian vertical escalation in the war. So everything ranging from potential chemical weapons use by the Russians, nuclear use, obviously, that everybody is thinking about at the moment, and obviously the last few days, there's concern about radiological dispersal devices, dirty bombs, etc., to try to deter the use of those sorts of capabilities. The US, the UK, and France have all been very critical of Russia for its nuclear signaling. And on the US side, for example, clear messages to Russia have been conveyed on the consequences of nuclear use in Ukraine, and catastrophic consequences, I think, is the term that has been used. A second element, I think, has been the Western allies have been seeking to deter Russian horizontal escalation outside of Ukraine and into sort of the NATO space. NATO has made conventional force deployments to eastern members. It's made various statements, etc., as a part of the deterrence posture here. Horizontal escalation might involve targeting of logistics supplies destined to Ukraine, perhaps on alliance territory, cyber attacks against NATO countries, the targeting of critical national infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And while this aspect of deterrence, focus on horizontal escalation, appears to have been successful in the conventional multi-domain and in the nuclear domain, of course, deterrence in the grey zone, which is always more tricky because of ambiguity and deniability, may be weakening as Russia comes under greater pressure on the ground. And Moscow has clearly begun to escalate grey zone activities against the West. We just have to think about the Nord Stream 1 and 2 events, likely Russia involved in that. There have been cyber attacks on the German railway system against some American airports, drone activity in Norway, to just name a few examples. And Russia, of course, has wielded the energy weapon since the beginning of the war, as Western sanctions on Moscow have deepened and widened, playing in particular on fears of inflation, cold winter in Europe, all wrapped up in that concept of energy security. And in doing so, Moscow is targeting the West's political cohesion, trying to undermine European countries' resolve to continue supporting Ukraine and seeking West European demands for ending the war on Russia's terms, or at least on terms that Putin can claim as a victory. There's been a concerted effort in Europe to reduce reliance on Russian oil and gas in the short and the longer term. And there's been a continued emphasis on seeking to avoid direct military contact with Russia. But while Western objectives and approaches to the war have much common ground across the NATO and the EU countries, they're not completely uniform, going back to a point I said before. The next slide, please. Okay, so a few more words on the nuclear aspect in the current context before trying to look forward a bit. So, as I'm sure we all agree, there is a credible pathway to Russian low-yield nuclear weapon use in the context of the Ukraine war. And I think since the start of the war, the risk of nuclear escalation by Moscow has been framed primarily against Russia's conventional military performance. The extent to which Russia or Ukraine succeeds militarily on the ground, and the potential inability of Putin to credibly declare some sort of victory. And this nuclear risk has come into sharper and sharper relief as a result of Russia's poor conventional military performance, and Ukraine's much more effective use of military power, supported, of course, by Western assistance. Anxiety, as Brad was saying, about the nuclear aspect has been heating up as a result of Ukraine's counteroffensive in the east and the south since early September. And throughout the majority of the war, the real risk from my perspective is focused on anything that might threaten to reverse Russian gains from 2014, notably its annexation of Crimea at that time. So that's where I thought the greatest pressure would come on Putin to resort to heightened nuclear threats and potentially nuclear use to try to compel a ceasefire and negotiations, i.e. preserving his 2014 gains. But with recent developments around the annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson provinces, plus increasing political rhetoric from senior Russian officials on the escalation potential and all means being available to defend Russian territory as defined by Moscow, the risk of nuclear use has intensified especially as the war on the ground remains very challenging for Russia given Ukraine's performance. And in the last week, we've had these accusations of Ukraine having a dirty bomb capability. We've also had continued accusations about bioweapons testing in Ukraine, etc., which raises the concern that on the Russian side, they may be preparing the ground for some form of escalation. Russia does have other levers to pull, of course, in terms of escalation against both Ukraine and against NATO to seek to influence decision-making. And we've seen a lot of that in action already. So in Ukraine, we've seen conventional artillery bombardment throughout the war and missile strikes, which have been escalating, the targeting of the grain shipments, targeting of critical national infrastructure in the last few weeks, the power infrastructure in particular, the crisis around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, placing explosives on dams, and so on and so forth. I think that any deliberate Russian nuclear escalation might be preceded by associated statements and observable activities on the ground, but I don't think that's necessarily guaranteed. I think the objective for such use, for such escalation, would likely be on freezing where things stand in the conflict at the moment and enabling a claim of victory to be made. I think paradoxically, resorting to such desperate measures would be both a sign of Russia's military strength, obviously, because it's using nuclear, but also a real signifier of Russia's military weakness, its conventional military weakness. And based on that point, it is clearly something I think Moscow would seek to avoid. Opting for a demonstration nuclear shot as part of an escalatory strategy could also potentially be perceived in Moscow as something that could signal Russia's weakness by reflecting uncertainty and a lack of resolve. So I guess what I'm saying is that if there is to be nuclear escalation, there may not be observable activities, and it may go straight to nuclear use and without a demonstration shot. If Putin cannot realistically claim some sort of victory or success, nuclear use increasingly becomes credible in Ukraine itself. And Putin has really created what are referred to in the literature as major audience costs for himself, both at home but also regionally and globally. And the fact that he the other day referred to the Hiroshima precedent in terms of nuclear use, this is something to be very, very concerned about. I think any Russian decision to employ a sub-strategic nuclear capability in Ukraine any decision would also be informed by Moscow's willingness to deal with the international reaction to such use, which could be expected to be, total trade embargo, living as a state-sponsored terrorism, full diplomatic and political isolation, or fuller stepped-up NATO deployments, potentially including nuclear. We've had the Polish comments about, wanting to have nuclear sharing arrangements. Perhaps there are nuclear sharing arrangements with the new members coming in too. Likely a much more robust NATO threat to Russia not to expand the war, and a strengthening international consensus on the unacceptability of such actions. I think within all that, China's reaction would also be very, very important for Putin's calculations and the role that China hopefully can play in convincing Russia this is not the direction to go. Ultimately, of course, we need to think about Putin's motivations here. How deep or wide is his appetite when it comes to this conflict? Next slide, please. Okay, so quick drink. I hope you're still out there. I always tell my students, it's like swimming the channel. Every now and again, you need to look behind to see, make sure the support boat is behind you. So I hope you're still there. Okay, so thinking about the future then.
Wyn, you still have 231 people with you, so rest assured you're being followed.
Great, thanks, Brad. The support boat is there. There's several support boats, Brad. A flotilla. Okay, so looking forward then, it might be a little premature to start trying to identify lessons to what deterrence and strategic stability might look like going forward from a Western perspective, and actually from a broader perspective. But I think some important issues can be highlighted already. So my comments in this sort of part of the talk are based on an assumption, really, that we actually don't see nuclear escalation in Ukraine by Russia, and that we see probably a refreezing of the conflict. Perhaps in the discussion we can address the question about, well, what if nuclear use happens? What does this mean for some of the points that I'm going to going to make. So some of these issues I'm going to flag, they're quite eclectic and quite broad ranging. So next slide, please. So the first point I was going to make is around conventional military deterrence and non-treaty bound partners. Deterrence by denial based on conventional armed force has received significant attention as a result of Ukraine's military performance. And with conventional deterrence, challenges tend to be influenced mostly by a defender's current or potential local balance of forces rather than a defender's overall capabilities. I think the performance of NATO-supplied Ukrainian forces in the current fighting will be a central plank of any future deterrence by denial posture in this context, as will be developing Ukraine's military interoperability with NATO. From a Western perspective, a denial-based approach would enable NATO and other like-minded countries to make a significant contribution to Ukraine's defense, both in the short and longer terms, at the same time as avoiding direct military contact with Russia. But there are lots of issues to think about here. The cost of helping Ukraine to do this, of course, the fact that NATO inventories have been depleted and need restocking, and thinking about the threshold for security assistance above which Moscow might seek to escalate. So similar to now, of course. And this is all going to require coordination amongst Western allies and the Ukrainians, short and long term, and a detailed understanding of Russia's perceptions of red lines in this area about what would be beyond the pale. Consideration should also be given, I think, to whether this type of conventional deterrence by denial approach can be adopted for other vulnerable non-NATO countries. Georgia might be another example. We've also got to factor in domestic political changes too, right, in NATO states. So you've got the midterms coming up in the United States shortly, and an interesting debate around Ukraine in that. You've got a new prime minister in Downing Street. Democracies don't stand still, right? And sometimes that may not be so good for deterrence. Next slide, please. NATO is basically going through a sort of a deterrence reset. So on the 20th of March, Secretary General Stoltenberg talked about the Allies building on a long-term reset of deterrence and defense. I think a key question here is, how does NATO get the balance right between traditional military kit and training, if you will, that's conventional, and the nuclear aspect, and countering hybrid warfare in its approach to deterring Russia? I think there are questions related to future role specialization, better collaboration within the alliance that will be important to look at here. Getting the balance right between these sort of, the more traditional side and the more sort of less traditional sort of hybrid side, getting that right is not just a discussion for NATO, of course. Coordinating with the European Union, with the G7 and so on will be absolutely essential to realizing integrated and full spectrum deterrence in this context. Some of this integration of the levers of influence and working across allied countries and organizations has been clearly on show during the Ukraine war, and clearly can be leveraged to contribute towards strengthening deterrence going forward. I think to bolster the alliance's direct deterrence of Russia in the future, particularly in terms of conventional denial capabilities, a key focus should be placed on understanding the extent to which Moscow extrapolates across in its strategic thinking from Ukraine to the direct NATO-Russia level. So that is based on Kyiv's military performance coupled with NATO security assistance and Russia's own poor military performance in Ukraine. To what extent will this experience enable a strengthening of the alliance's deterrence posture as it relates to the Baltics, for example? And to what extent will Russia's military experience in Ukraine self-deter it going forward? While Russian military competence has been severely called into question in Ukraine, it is at the same time essential that NATO not overstate Russian military failings. I think we must guard against not taking the wrong lessons from a campaign which the Russian military does not actively train for. Next slide, please. Okay. I had one final point, I guess, around the NATO strategic concept, so that's fine. You can leave that aside there. So the new NATO strategic concept from a few months ago highlights for the first time the direct challenge posed by China to the alliance. Talks about the systemic challenge posed by the PRC to Euro-Atlantic security, and so on and so forth. And I think given China and Russia's, in quotes, no limits friendship, and Beijing's growing conventional nuclear military capability, this is going to have to be factored into the alliance's deterrence thinking going forward, because of the potential for dealing with two hostile and allied nuclear armed states simultaneously. So I think, as we think about general deterrence going forward, this cannot be considered now from a broader Western perspective. It has, we have to take into account the European context, but also the Indo-Pacific region as well. Okay, so moving on to some sort of nuclear issues. So I think when or if the war in Ukraine results in a refreezing of that conflict, and assuming that the war does not escalate in the nuclear sense, so what are the issues that might frame nuclear issues going forward? I've got 4 issues. There'll be lots of others, but I've got 4 here. My first one is that thus far, the war in Ukraine and Russian nuclear signaling has shown that nuclear deterrence works. NATO has been deterred from getting involved militarily in a direct sense. Looking ahead, different actors may take different lessons in this respect, depending on where they sit. For newer nuclear weapon states like the DPRK, even for India and Pakistan, and potential nuclear aspirants like Iran, the lesson is probably that the possession of nuclear weapons can help to protect vital interests and potentially at the same time enable a certain amount of flexibility in how the conventional military lever can be used in pursuit of national interests in conflict with other state actors. For example, if you think about if Iran acquired a nuclear weapons capability in the medium to long term, this could potentially be seen in Tehran as a means to be even more assertive regionally in how it uses proxy forces to secure its interests. Second point, I think, is that the writing on the tin of the much vaunted modernization of Russia's conventional military forces over the past 2 decades has clearly not been matched by the contents of the tin. Russia's poor conventional military performance and its significant combat losses will see Moscow increase its reliance on nuclear forces as a means to compensate going forward, and I think for many, many years, notably on its non-strategic nuclear capability. I think related to this, the war has fed anxiety in some parts of the defense and security establishment in the United States about the limits of the US nuclear stockpile and about what is referred to by senior military people in Washington as the deterrence and assurance gap. There's clearly a military concern about the US ability to match both existing Russian and emerging Chinese capabilities at the sub-strategic level, and what that might mean for US military power application around the world. Russia, as we know, holds a significant advantage over the United States and the alliance in terms of the types of non-strategic targets it can hold at risk, with around 2,000 or so low-yield weapons. And we've got China's ambition, albeit very opaque, and its nuclear modernization and expansion as a major cause of concern in the nuclear area too. General Todd Walters, before he retired as commander of EUCOM, told Congress earlier this year that having multiple options that adversaries have to think about exacerbates the challenge for potential adversaries acting against us. So elements of this debate have been around, for example, the arguments for a new submarine-launched nuclear cruise missile with a low-yield warhead. There have been arguments made that the United States should even move away from New START because it overly constrains the United States for a future where it is going to face a much more capable nuclear China alongside Russia's existing nuclear challenge. In an allied context, does this deterrence and assurance gap logic apply to British and French thinking, right? France deploys a dyad of nuclear forces. It's got a submarine-launched long-range ballistic capability and an air-launched cruise missile capability, the latter of which provides for a sub-strategic option. In the United Kingdom, the integrated review of defence and foreign policy last year increased ambiguity around the total number of warheads in the UK stockpile and around the numbers of missiles and warheads deployed on the operational boat at any one time. The question here is, should the UK be contemplating becoming more ambiguous still, given the war in Ukraine? And does the UK perceive a gap emerging specifically in terms of British nuclear assets? We've got an update of the integrated review ongoing at the moment. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. And from a European perspective, UK and French perspective, what if a new administration in the United States goes easier on Russia in 2 years or so time, and muddies the water on NATO again, like we had a few years ago? The second center of decision-making argument and the insurance policy argument for these two independent nuclear forces then come into focus more, or could come into focus more. Next slide, please. There will also be implications, for strategic stability and what that looks like going forward in the evolving geopolitical landscape. Both arms race stability in terms of quantitative and qualitative improvements in nuclear arsenals, and also in terms of crisis stability, worries about incentives to use nuclear weapons in crises, and this being framed by now a tripolar nuclear competition. The NATO strategic concept, the new one, mentions strategic stability, but doesn't really get into defining it, probably because at the moment it's too difficult to do that. It talks about how it can be delivered and how it can be eroded, but in quite general terms. But it does make the usual references to effective deterrence and defense, arms control, disarmament, political dialogue, and so on and so forth. I don't have the answers to what strategic stability looks like going forward, but I know some of the research questions, and I've just thrown some of those questions onto the slide. To what extent do we need to define strategic stability more broadly than the traditional focus on nuclear? In a multipolar world, how do strategic chains link together, where the actions of one influence the actions of another, and then another, etc. How is disruptive technology going to have an influence? The debate about hypersonics, for example. How will nuclear doctrines evolve? Can arms control play a role in providing for arms race stability in the current circumstances, right? Doubtful. What about conventional arms control that we used to have in Europe? Can we bring that back? What about transparency of nuclear forces, confidence building, etc., etc.? And what lessons are we going to take from crisis stability from Ukraine in due course? So lots of questions here, which I'm not answering, just being a typical academic about it. And then the final question, though, is will strategic stability or providing for it in the future depend mostly on non-cooperative approaches, i.e., more emphasis on the deterrence piece and less on the arms control and the CBMs? Next slide, please. And I'll try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. Sanctions and deterrence. So, moving sort of more broadly now, and, this is all about integrated deterrence, right? So sanctions have traditionally been applied to signal, to constrain, or to compel change behavior rather than to deter action. And I think whilst the US and the UK in particular were not convinced that deterrence would work before the invasion, the effort to deter by threatening sanctions was essential, I think, then from shifting the gears into actually imposing sanctions after the invasion had begun. And I think, the imposition of sanctions provides for much greater credibility down the line in terms of how sanctions might be potentially used to deter either Russia in the future or other actors, because there's a demonstrable track record of how sanctions have been used. While sanctions have not deterred Putin from brutally pressing on with his objectives, the long-term impact on the Russian economy looks set to be deep-seated and long-lasting. And I think that is clearly being watched by other players around the world. And even Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is on record as saying that the scale of the sanctions imposed on Russia after the invasion had actually taken Moscow by some surprise. But countries like China, for example, if we're thinking about the role that sanctions may play there, they're accelerating their efforts to de-dollarize and to reduce their dependence on the US going forward, and therefore trying to reduce vulnerabilities to financial and other economic sanctions. And of course, China is much more integrated into the global economy and the global supply chains, so it would make that much more difficult anyway. Next slide, sorry. The private sector. So I want to say two quick things on the role of the private sector. The private sector arguably has gone well beyond what Western sanctions actually required them to do, particularly in the early stages of the war, in terms of withdrawing from Russia. And that may have implications going forward for escalation control. Just think about McDonald's will withdraw from Russia, costed around $1 billion. I think the moral outrage of such companies and their apparent willingness to pull the plug in similar circumstances is something that needs to be factored in by Western governments when they're looking to deter future malign state behavior. At one level, the lack of control of the private sector means that I think consideration needs to be given to the risk that the private sector escalation might outstrip that which governments can keep up with. But at the same time, of course, this lack of control can be built into deterrence signaling. The fact that the private sector will do its own thing if it is morally outraged. And then the second issue in the private sector, we've all seen the role played by Elon Musk in his provision of Starlink assets to provide pivotal assistance to the Ukrainian armed forces in terms of communications, etc. So the question I've got here is, well, how will the commercial sector's ability to directly influence the prosecution of armed conflict at the tactical and operational levels in real time influence thinking about deterrence going forward? Both deterrence of conflict itself in the first place and then intra-war deterrence. And to look at that from both a blue team perspective and a red team perspective. Again, I'm throwing out mostly questions here, but I think this is a really important issue. Next slide, please. I was going to talk about ambiguity and deterrence briefly, but I think I will hop over that one. So next slide. And then I was going to briefly say something about sort of the role of intelligence here very quickly. So I think the role played by the UK and US intelligence in the war has been one of the most notable aspects of the Western involvement. We saw we've seen pre and intra-war declassification of intelligence for sharing with allies, for public release to bolster Allied resolve and to call out Russian intentions and false flag operations. It's also involved the provision of battlefield intelligence to the Ukrainian military. And I think going forward, it's important to assume we cannot assume rather a similar approach will have the same effect in the future. I think the successful use of intelligence is likely to prompt adversaries and potential adversaries to better understand Western sources and methods and how these have been used to develop denial and deception measures in order to reduce their reliability and effect, and to design information campaigns to negate it, and so on and so forth. And then one last slide, please. I think we'd be remiss not to perhaps mention Taiwan briefly at the end. There's been a lot of speculation about what Beijing and Taipei may be learning from the war in terms of their own approaches to deterrence and also to compellence as this relates to Taiwan's future. So very briefly, I'll finish up on this now too. I mean, for Beijing, for example, it's going to have clearly learned from some of Russia's incorrect pre-war assumptions. It's going to have observed Russian military mistakes, learned about the breadth, depth, and effect of the sanctions imposed on Russia, although it is a very different country in that sense, as I've said. It will recognize the double-edged sword of being inextricably tied to the West economically. It's vulnerable to sanctions, but also it possesses much greater coercive economic power than Russia, given its role in supply chains. It will have further confirmed the need to reduce reliance on the dollar, and it will have observed that the United States and NATO have been deterred from direct military involvement by Russia's nuclear capability and its related signaling. There's going to be other lessons I'm sure that they are taking on board. For Taipei, I think it's going to be absorbing an equal amount of lessons: the importance of mobilizing society and reserve forces, the importance of asymmetric denial-based approach to defense and deterrence, the challenge of logistics supplies to an island during a conflict with the mainland, having sufficient stocks of key weapon systems, and the desirability of less ambiguous security commitments from the United States and from other states in the region too. There'll be other aspects, I think, and I haven't even mentioned the US view on that one as well. Next slide, please. So I'll just conclude then very, very briefly. That was a bit of a sort of a canter through some issues, right? There'll be many other issues related to the future of deterrence that I haven't touched upon. And there's a huge amount of thinking, I think, to be done in how integrated deterrence in particular is actually operationalized in the future. The war is ongoing. We don't know where it's headed. And I think, some developments in that war would obviously question some of the things that I've probably said, for example, if we see nuclear use at some point. So Brad, I'll draw it to a close there. I'm happy to have a good discussion now with people. Thank you.
Thank you, Wyn. That was a tour de force, very comprehensive and thought-provoking.